Initiative can take in order to maximize the benefits from the Belt and Road and to identify the risks and manage them. So that's really our objective with this series of studies and this ongoing work. So everything that I'm going to say is not set in stone, and actually the reason why we want to have these meetings is exactly to have feedback on our work. So what I'll talk about this morning is just say something about the Belt and Road Initiative. That's a sort of public good, so the others won't have to do it. Then I'll talk about the connectivity gaps in the Belt and Road, among Belt and Road economies, and then say something about the effects, and I'll mostly focus on the trade effects. So let me start with something on the Belt and Road Initiative. This is a map that probably you have seen other times. The Belt and Road Initiative was proposed by China in 2013. Is a plan to improve cooperation and connectivity at a transcontinental scale. There is no exact definition of what are Belt and Road economies. I think this is in part on purpose. But the backbone of the Belt and Road Initiative is a series of economic corridors, or transport corridors, over land. Those are the 6 that you see in red in the map. And then a series of improvements, new ports to improve maritime connectivity. And that's the new maritime Silk Road. Since there is no definition of the Belt and Road in itself, there is also no official list of countries, so we had to take a decision in order to study them. And so we focus on 70 countries plus China, which are geographically located along the Belt and Road. And this is a big project. If you think in terms of trade, it's almost 40% of world trade. There are many numbers out there on the size of the investments that will imply. They are a bit all over the place. They go between $1 trillion US to 10 trillion. We did our back of the envelope calculation for the projects that we consider in this study. But the certain thing is that it's a big project. It will have opportunities and many challenges. The main opportunities that we see, since we focus on the connectivity side, is the fact that these new infrastructure projects will improve infrastructure, transport infrastructure, so reduce some of the gaps that exist in this large area. They will reduce trade cost and therefore have a positive impact on trade, on economic growth, and on poverty reduction. They will also help some developing, lagging, or isolated regions to connect better. And obviously, the more this will be combined with reforms on the trade side, reforms on FDIs or complementary policies, these effects will likely be magnified. Now, as every infrastructure projects, large infrastructure projects, there are many, many challenges that have to do with the risk of stranded infrastructure, the usual white elephants, the fact that there can be environmental risks, social risks, corruption, governance risks, the fact that there can be issues on public procurement, fiscal debt sustainability, and others. Let me stress one point that I'll come back at the end again. The less we know about the Belt and Road Initiative, the less there is transparency, the fewer data we have, the higher the risks are going to be. Now, in this presentation, because I want to talk on the trade side, I'll mostly focus on the opportunities, so on the positive side. But the research that we are doing at the World Bank covers both opportunities and challenges, and I'm sure that the other speakers will deal with many of them. Now, let me start with some big picture slides. As I was saying, this is an area that almost accounts for 40% of world trade. A large share of it is China, obviously, and East Asia, so an area that is highly integrated in in global value chains and regional value chains. And there are many large disparities. There are many countries in South Asia, in the Middle East and North Africa, etc., that are very poorly integrated into world markets. So we did a simple exercise using a gravity model to understand the extent of missing trade. And what we found is that BRI economies undertrade with each other of roughly 30%, and similar, they undertrade with the rest of the world for a little bit more than 30%. So where can these gaps come from? Where does this missing trade come from? One possibility is that is the lack of infrastructure. And indeed, there have been several studies out there that says that there are important infrastructure gaps in the developing world in general. The Asian Development Bank had a recent study that says that for developing Asia, the gap is around 1.7 trillion per year. Up to 2030. Obviously, this is not just transport infrastructure, and it's not just cross-border infrastructure, which is the main focus here. This involves many other areas, but it gives the idea that there can be gaps. So what we did was to look at the logistic performance indicator, which is something that, an indicator that we built at the World Bank, which gives, it's a survey that gives the perception of the quality of transport infrastructure. The indicator ranges between 1 and 5, and on average for Belt and Road economies is 2.7. So this suggests that there are important transport infrastructure gaps. But the gaps are probably even more important considering that this is a very heterogeneous area. So some of the countries in the BRI are actually very high performers. Think of Singapore. But there are several that are at the bottom of the list of the LPI, and examples are Afghanistan and Bhutan. In addition to infrastructure gaps, there are important policy gaps. And here there are just two examples. So if we compare BRI economies with G7s, they're generally the best performers, they tend to have higher tariffs. For instance, if you look at South Asia, average applied tariffs are above 12%. They're much smaller, below 4% for G7 economies. When you look at the border delays, so we use here the border compliance, import compliance from the doing business indicators, the gaps are even more strikingly. For G7 economies, it takes only a few hours to clear a border, to comply with all the border procedures. It takes several days in South Asia and the Middle East and North Africa, and a lot more in the sub-Saharan countries that are part of the BRI as we define it. So let me say something about the effects that, if you want, is the more researchy part of our work. So hopefully it's in this context, it's even more interesting. So what the first challenge we had is that there is no definition of what are BRI projects. So we had to make our own list, and we use consultants and country teams. And as I said, we focus on transport infrastructure. And as you see in this map, the purple, the darker purple, the bolder purple lines are the new or improved rail projects. And the anchors are the new or improved port projects. So you see, this is really mostly about rail and ports. And then the yellows are some new streets, highways. They are the minority of the project. And as I say, just to get a sense, we did for rail and ports, which is mostly what we use in the analysis, a back-on-the-envelope calculation of what they would cost, and it ranges between 400 and 600 billions, talking of US dollars, obviously. Now, the first thing is that we use geographic information system analysis to calculate how much this new infrastructure will reduce shipping time, travel times. It really works as an app, the app in your phone. So you want to know how long it takes to go from point A to point B. And that's essentially what the GIS analysis does in a fancier way. And then, because we had this information on the transport projects that we were able to localize on a map, we recalculated the time that it takes to reach point B from point A after all these projects, BRI projects have been implemented. And the difference between the two, it gives you the improvements in shipment times. And what we find that we think it's already an interesting result is that the BRI projects will reduce time between BRI countries, around 3.2% on average. Obviously, along the corridors, it's much larger. So for some corridors, it arrives to a reduction of 12%. But the other interesting thing is that it reduces trade times for the world. So there are positive spillover effects. And if you think about it, this makes sense because this improvement in infrastructure are different from preferential tariffs, are non-discriminatory. So once you reduce, you improve a port, you improve it for everyone. You don't improve it only for your neighbors. So there is an important systemic effect. And obviously, there are differences across countries. The darker red that you see there, it means larger improvements. And not surprisingly, where there are these infrastructures, there tend to be larger gains. Now, the important thing is that trade times are one key component of trade cost. So as you reduce trade times, you also reduce trade cost. And so we used several different tools that are commonly used by economists to quantify the effects on first on trade and then, as you will see, also on GDP and FDI. So the first application is gravity. And the first finding is that this infrastructure improvement will increase trade among BRI economies of 4%. So this is for BRI economies. Now, obviously, countries will be affected differently. Some countries will have a larger impact than others, and that essentially depends on two things. The first is that for some countries, the connectivity gains are larger. They reduce more travel times, and then you see a bigger impact. And the second has to do with the economic structure of countries, so essentially what they import and what they export. And the reason for this is what you see on the other panel to your right. We are reducing travel times, and different products have different time sensitivities. So if you think of fresh fruits and vegetables, because they perish, they tend to be very time sensitive. Even more interestingly, there are products that are part of value chains. This is, for instance, the case for chemistry products that have very time sensitive inputs. Machineries obviously would be another example. So they really need the just in time. So there is this direct and this indirect effect that really matters and makes different products react more to changes in travel time, so to changes of the BRI more, and this also affects how much trade by country will be affected. So in other words, if you want, it changes, it affects also comparative advantage of countries. Now, the second exercise that we did is to use CG, a computable general equilibrium model. The advantage of this is that it gives you also information on the welfare implication of the BRI. So there is an impact on trade, but there is an impact on welfare essentially for two reasons. The first is that the production side, there is a reallocation of resources, and so there is larger production. The second is on the consumption side. Imports become cheaper, and this increases consumer welfare and therefore social welfare. The second point that I wanted to stress here is the impact on the rest of the world. Because of the reasons that I said earlier, that this transport infrastructure have a non-discriminatory nature, there is a positive effect on trade and on welfare for the rest of the world. Third point that I would like to stress here, if you may be wondering what these different colors mean, so the blue is the impact on trade and welfare of the infrastructure alone. And then on orange and in gray, you see the impact of complementary policies. Orange is a simple exercise that we did reducing by half border delays. So you can think of this as improving trade facilitation. For instance, some of the countries in the BRI are not members of the WTO, so they didn't sign the TFA. Some others are members of the WTO, but they didn't implement the TFA yet. So these kind of reforms would have an additional boost on trade. And again, because these are, when you improve borders, it's not discriminatory in nature, it has a positive spillover effects on the rest of the world. Last exercise in gray is a reduction of tariffs. This is preferential, so it's just among BRI economies. So there is a boost in trade and welfare for BRI economies, but because of trade diversion, there can be a negative spillover effects through trade on the rest of the world. Now, the last set of exercise that we did was to look at additional effects. So there are a few things that gravity models and CGE models don't really pick up. The first is the reduction of internal transport cost, and the second is the impact on foreign direct investment, and that's what we are showing here on this slide. So for the reduction of internal transport cost, we use a structural model. For those of you that are familiar with the literature, we use Caliendo and the model by Caliendo and Parro. And here, what this says is that there is an additional boost on GDP that comes from the reduction of transport time, travel time within countries. So think of Laos. This is a country that is building a long infrastructure, a long rail that goes from north to south. It will help it connect to neighboring countries, but it will also help it connect to itself. And this will imply efficiency gains within the country, which are picked up here. The second, and that's the figure on your left, is the impact on growth through the reduction of travel times. And here the intuition is the following. FDI have an impact on growth, and FDI depend, among other things, on trade times. So as the Belt and Road will reduce trade times between countries, it will also help countries attract more FDI, and therefore this will provide an extra kick to economic growth. Another interesting thing that you can see here, and this is something that we did not necessarily expect when we started the study, the largest effects are mostly concentrated on lower income countries. So this set of projects will particularly help that set of countries. Okay, so let me conclude so I give time to others to talk about the other aspects of the BRI. So what we're doing here, and let me say this again, this is work in progress. But what we're trying to do is to try to assess first the impact of the BRI on trade, welfare, and other economic variables. And our preliminary findings find that the BRI will reduce trade costs because it will reduce travel times between this country and the rest of the world. Obviously, sectors will be impacted differently depending on their time sensitivities. So as usual, there will be winners and losers, but the aggregate gains that we find are positive. And we also find that the BRI will have a positive spillover effects on third countries, on the rest of the world. The second finding is that there are important complementarities in policies. If BRI countries implement trade facilitation policies that reduce border delays, if they reduce barriers to trade, I gave the example of preferential tariffs, if they reduce FDI restrictions, these gains will be magnified. And this obviously applies also to another number of policy areas that I didn't have the time to discuss. One important one in our view is public procurement. Finally, I didn't talk at all about the risks, but we know that there are important economic and non-economic risks associated to the BRI, mostly because these are very large infrastructure projects. The one that many people are discussing right now, for good reasons, is concerns on public debt sustainability. Our preliminary analysis shows that China and non-Paris Club members are a small fraction of the debt of countries, but when you look at low-income developing countries by risk, you see that the share is substantially higher. And then obviously there are the governance, the environmental, and the social concerns. And these are very difficult to quantify. If you think in terms of environmental concerns, it's not just the direct effects that infrastructure have. They can have a negative impact on important biodiversity hotspots, but there are also the indirect effects that have to do with changes in land use, with the impact on pollution. So there are important things to study, and we are trying to work on that. And let me stress again the last point. All the risks are going to be magnified the less we know about the BRI, the less data we have, the less transparency there is in all these projects. So thank you very much for your time, and if you want to know more, we have a website on regional integrations that covers this topic, covers the topic of the next session and other work that the World Bank is doing on regional integration. Thanks.
Thank you, Michela, for that excellent presentation on the extent of activities of the Belt and Road Initiative, as well as the World Bank's activities in tracking what might be those impacts. Nonetheless, according to other things I've read, I'm wondering if we should just view these activities as innocuous investments in infrastructure in regions that desperately need inputs, or whether there is some strategic vision associated with the projects, or at least some unconventional practice that should concern some. And I think you touched on one of those about the debt sustainability and debt practice. So to shed a little bit more light on this initiative, I turn to Lou, who is a professor at the University of International Business and Economics and a former diplomat here in Geneva and in Brussels. Lou, the floor is yours.
Thank you, Teresa, and thanks a lot to you and Michela for organizing this. It's always good to be back in this group and meeting a lot of old friends. I mean, Michela has given you quite a nice global picture about what this initiative and how it looks like. So I'm going to do simply two things to humbly contribute to complement to what he has just said. The first thing is that because BRI was, as Michela has said, that was announced in 2013, so 5 years have passed. In China, we always do a kind of homework wrapping up always after 5 years or 10 years. So Chinese central government has just done a thorough kind of report on what has been done there during the past 5 years. So I'm going to quickly walk you through that. And then the second thing is that some of the challenges that Michela has been talking about, I'm going to maybe dig a little bit deeper into a few of them just to show you what things I discuss in China and what do we think and what do we think about the global kind of views on this. So the first thing is that, you know, this initiative, one thing probably for you to know why that there's such a kind of transparency issue, why there are some kind of pros and cons on that. The simple thing is that when it was announced in 2013, this was really something top-down from the top leader, President Xi himself. And to be frank with you, that year I was still in Chinese mission as a senior diplomat, and I was not prepared. I had no clue at all that what that meant. And then I read what he said in Kazakhstan afterwards in Indonesia, and I said, oh, that's a nice story, because the Silk Road is a treasure in our memory, so it's always nicely used for diplomatic statements. But I didn't realize it's going to be such an initiative that would have such an impact. So the funny thing is that if you go back to the past 5 years, you will see that a lot of central government ministries, and they have been trying to catch up with the vision from top leadership and try to understand what he meant and how to faithfully deliver the vision. So that's why that a lot of ministries, including the Ministry of Trade, Commerce, and others, their action plans actually came out almost 2 or 3 years after this was announced. So that explains the vision between implementation. The second thing is that, you know, one thing also to explain what Michela has said, that normally in China, when we do the research and analysis, we try to limit ourselves to the so-called 65 countries, including China, which geographically along the continental Silk Road and also the maritime one. But of course, as Xi and Chinese central government has said that this is an open platform for everyone who wants to be part of it, be it any countries who are far away from these two Silk Roads, or be it any international organizations, NGOs, universities. If you want to be part of it, you're welcome. So that's why actually a lot of things are happening beyond these countries, and so that explains also the global magnitude. In terms of contents, of course, a lot of have been focused on infrastructure investment and also trade and investment, but actually if you look at the picture above that, it is the most comprehensive initiative by any country that covers everything you could imagine in international relations. It talks about policy coordination, facilitation, facilities, connectivity, so that's infrastructure, transport, and everything. Trade and investment, free trade agreements, bilateral investment agreements, and so on and so forth. Financing integration means monetary cooperation, all kinds of things going on. Chinese banks are also going along the Belt and Road, trying to sign bilateral agreements with all those countries. And also, of course, cultural exchange, including people. So Ministry of Education and also Ministry of Culture, they have been doing a lot to do. So this is really comprehensive. Anything you want, it's here. So you could easily find something there if you want to cooperate with China and under this framework. So coming back to what I want to say, so 5 years have passed, and China has done a nice press conference, a nice report. So let's quickly walk through them now. Agreements with over 100 countries and also international organizations, including UN, G20, APEC, and WTO, ITC. They have all kind of MOUs, cooperation agreements with China, and some of them are already being launched and implemented in various framework. Big projects, including infrastructure, are all there, including railway, road, maritime, and also just for in terms of ports, which has, of course, quite a geopolitical kind of importance. That in China's report, they said that 42 ports in 34 Belt and Road countries, and also the roads and others, there are plenty. And here is a list of what I've done in Middle East about the bigger infrastructure projects. As Miguel has said that in China, there's a series of cost transparency issue there. I mean, you don't have a central platform where you could easily find all the statistics. It's scattered all over the place in ministry websites, in news reports, government statements, and also, so this is something I digged a lot and trying to put them together. Some of the bigger projects, it includes airports, ports, solar plants, manufacturing facilities, and so on and so forth in the Middle East. And so there are quite a lot going on there, and which would, of course, attract our attention. The thing here is that a lot of things, and Miguel has talked about the infrastructure importance. So that's actually something I think very important. The first one is from Mombasa to Nairobi, the railway. And what I have read on the news report, they say that the transport time has been reduced from over 20 hours to less than 4 hours. And then there was another railway, I think also in Africa, which the transport time was cut from over 20 days to also about around 10 hours. So the substantially reducing costs, such as logistic cost, has been cut for this one, 40%. And you say that the Kenyan GDP, there was an extra GDP growth of 1.5% of Kenya after this railway was constructed, and then has created 46,000 jobs for the local community. So they quite nicely. And the second one is a solar plant in Morocco. It's called NOAA, and first stage, second stage, third stage. After everything is created, Morocco would be turned from a kind of country short of electricity from a much better to a much better position, and this single one will provide 50% of the electricity needs of the country. So there are many things that if well done, could provide good benefits for the local community. Of course, we have pipelines, And we have this famous China-Europe Express, and which are connecting 43 cities in 30 also countries, and then direct flights more with 43 countries, and so on and so forth. So the connectivity is much enhanced by all the infrastructure there. And then in terms of trade, our favorite topic, in 2017, 1.4 trillion has been achieved. Of course, in the past 5 years, 5 trillion in total. And this is achieved against the global picture of kind of trade going down and negative growth. And actually, China has achieved 1.1 growth in the past 5 years annually with the Belt and Road countries. So quite a nice job. Also, the FDI along those countries amounted to 70 billion US dollars. And also, this is against the background that you remember, for both because of Chinese domestic policy limitations and also foreign policies, that Chinese investment in 2017, China's mergers and acquisition projects has been reduced by 50% in 2017. And then the volume has been cut by 10%. But in that year, China's investment of mergers and acquisitions along Belt and Road countries has increased by 32.5%. So there's quite a nice growth there for this. And here is something I would drag your attention to. I will talk more a little bit about this, because remember, we have talked a lot about the infrastructure and all those things. But you would understand that infrastructure, be it railway and roads, they have to be used. Otherwise, they are just nice there and they are useless. We have learned actually hard lessons from this, because long time ago, you know that China has built also railways in Africa. And this famous one, this so-called Tanzania and Zambia railway, which was built in the 70s. I wanted to see it with my vice ministers when I was in the government. And to be frank with you, it's nice, clean, but few passengers there for all kinds of reasons. And then I forgot to put one picture actually on the website. You could Google that. And some of the railways in Africa, after they are built, no trains were running on it. You know what the local innovative African colleagues have done? They have put up a very shabby wooden structure and with a motorcycle, and sometimes even with a bicycle on it. And they use that to drive along the railway, on the railway, to transport the people, rice, chickens on that. And it was fantastic, I mean. But of course, it doesn't serve the purposes. So what China has been done in the past few years is that when they are trying to build the infrastructure, be it ports, be it railway, be it roads, and all that, China has also tried to complement that with these so-called overseas economic and trade cooperation zones. You could call industrial zones or high-tech zones, whatever. China has established 82 such zones along the Belt and Road countries. The reason is because first China has done well with that since 1978. We first opened the coastal areas, a few cities, and all the way into the inland. And the first thing is always to do, find a zone, build all the infrastructure there, attracting enterprises to go there, to invest, to manufacture, and then that creates an ecosystem, and of course also jobs and salaries. So that has worked well, at least for a few kind of projects. This is what they have said, that all these 82 have attracted more than 4,000 enterprises and created 24,000 new jobs for the local community. And this is one of the, in the Middle East, called the Taida Suez Economic and Trade Cooperation Zone. And actually, before the zone was established, I mean, there were already enterprises signing contracts to go in, and then afterwards, the local banks, foreign banks, or they were all one thing. So finally, it was such a small area and attracted more than 70 enterprises and increased trade and increased jobs and created salaries. And that also provides the basic thing, the products for the railway to transport, and then local people have salaries, and so they could travel on it. So that helps to overcome a kind of potential risk. Again, on trade, I mean, free trade things, free trade agreements was signed, but of course, before this initiative was announced, now we have 3 with 12 Belt and Road countries, mostly 10 ASEAN countries, and then we have a few others with ours. But ongoing are limited. We have 1 ongoing with GCC, Israel, and then we are still doing a feasibility study with Palestine, but it's going to be challenging, especially for GCC negotiation. It has been there for decades. So, sorry. Coming back to what I say, other than 10 ASEAN countries, it means it is also 1 with Pakistan, another with Singapore. So altogether, 12 countries there. So coming back to what I think about the challengers, of course, when she announced this, and also he said this 2 years ago here in Geneva in the UN, and in Chinglish word, he said that this is an objective which aims to achieve the common community of destiny for human society. I mean, 人类命运共同体, that's what he said. But of course, I mean, my basic humble translation of it is that it is an initiative for common development and common progress of all on equal footing. But it's nicely said, and China tried to deny it from the very beginning. It's not a geopolitical thing. It's nothing initiative, and China tried to differentiate it from the Marshall Plan and so on and so forth. So I don't want to go into the details about the reason, but you would read it easily on the website. But of course, we know that even it is not a geopolitical thing, it has geopolitical implications. Because if you look at carefully of these corridors, economic ones, they pass a lot through sensitive areas. You have Central Asia, where Russia is there, and you have Middle East, you have US and others there, and you have in the south, the maritime one, you have India there, Japan there, and so on and so forth. Of course, everywhere you have the US. And of course, those are the kind of already not existing tensions between the big players in the region. So there are many things that we have to be aware that is not a simple thing, which you will launch it and people would accept it. The first thing is, of course, the challenge is the perception. I mean, the Western world, mostly Western world, I would say, because beneficial and other developing countries, they tend to need Chinese investment, infrastructure, manufacturing capacity. That's more or less easier. But for Western world, developed ones, the perception is that do you take it as an opportunity or do you take it as a threat? I mean, this is one of the New York Times has said, and there are many other nasty reports about this. Of course, you would find it on the website. And one example you would see about China and the EU, because we're here in Europe, China has established a forum which is called Cooperation between China and Central Eastern European countries, 16 countries from Central and Eastern Europe plus 1. So it's called 16 plus 1. And the funny thing is that out of the 16 countries, you have 10 from the EU, mostly Eastern and Central Asian ones. EU had quite a big concern on that. This is on the left, the picture is former Foreign Affairs Minister Gabriele from Germany. And he basically said that stop dividing EU and it's undermining the EU values and so on and so forth. So China became, especially in the last few months, became very sensitive towards this. And this on the right is the picture between the, just a few months ago, a senior meeting between Chinese Premier Li Keqiang and the Bulgarian Premier, I think that's him. So they were discussing about cooperation potential projects. So Bulgarian Prime Minister just said, okay, hey, I want to build a road here. But they couldn't see. They were sitting across the table. So Bulgarian Prime Minister moved to the Chinese side, sitting together with Chinese Premier, which is something rarely seen in diplomatic senior meetings. He laid down a map and said, it's from here to there, I want to build a road, and I want China to do it. And Premier Li, in the report, immediately said that, good, we could do it. But why don't we engage Western European countries, other EU countries? Let's do it together. And then the Bulgarian Prime Minister also said that, I want to also build a tunnel here from here. He said, yeah, let's do it. But let's talk to the EU, and let's do a kind of so-called trilateral cooperation. So the funny thing here is that a lot of researchers have said that China, even China with this initiative, with its financing capacity, it cannot finance everything. I mean, a lot of reports say that in Asia, infrastructure gap, investment gap is half, and then in Africa, it's like more than 70%. So we have to do it together. So here was also, I don't have the figure, not exhaustive, list, just 3 examples of what this so-called trilateral cooperation means. So China, Germany has done one thing, kind of so-called DG Cement in Pakistan. China, France, of course, has worked together on this Hinkley station, nuclear power station. China, Korea also did something with refinery in Ecuador. So there are quite a few, not many, things going on there of this so-called trilateral cooperation, which I think is nice. But the problem is that on one hand, China has a transparency problem. So not many things are announced beforehand, so people would know and go ahead and engage. On the other hand, there's no mechanism yet, except one between China and France. There's a joint fund and to do that. Other than that, very little. But of course, it's not only the China should do more transparency also, but beneficiary countries, when they want to do a big infrastructure, they should be the one to announce it, make it transparent, and try to help talk to different stakeholders, make it happen also. So it needs a joint efforts there. So challenges also, we have heard about this implication on debt. I mean, well, many things need to be careful there. What China has basically said that is that, well, the beneficiary countries in these poor areas, their debt has been long existing before China came, okay? So the second thing is that, well, it's not only China, but the beneficiary countries should also be aware of their capacity to pay back and so on. So it's also need a lot of joint efforts there. Challenges on environmental, social aspects also reported in many newspapers. Personally speaking, some of them I think do make sense, such as some railways, if they are not well constructed, they block the traditional traveling routes of the African animals, and there was accidents of trains bumped into lines and other. So, I mean, there are problems here. But on the other hand, I do saw some of the reports, including some American ones, a little bit not justified. One thing they talk about the social aspect is that China is not paying the same salary to the Africans as to the Chinese. I mean, come on. The people go there to invest because they want to use a low local cost, right? And you guys, Western investors, you have done this for decades in China. My wife used to work in a joint venture in China. Her salary is only 50% of similar level from someone from the original investor country. So I mean, that's a big thing. You cannot change that. The second thing, funny thing also about report is that the Chinese don't allow the Africans to sit together with Chinese people for lunch or dinner. Well, and then one Chinese reporter and counter argued that is that they're eating different things. Chinese eat rice, noodles, and something, which the locals don't eat. And then they are talking Chinese, they don't necessarily all speak English. So, I mean, naturally, they will go to different places. Well, so, I mean, there's a fussy there. I mean, so we need to look more carefully about this. Coming back to environmental challenges, I mean, Chinese is well aware of that. So 4 central ministries of China has published 2 years ago this so-called guidelines to push green One Belt One Road construction. So there's a very detailed guidelines there are what to be cautious on and how to do it and so on and so forth. Of course, this is not a binding thing; it's a guideline. So implementation should also be something we need to observe. I think this is the last part of it. So coming back to what I want to say, just in conclusion. So challenges for China is that there's a geopolitical implication, and then there's a perception gap there, and there's a transparency issue. There are sustainability challenges, including debt, environmental protection, so on and so forth. But that, I think that as I said from the very beginning, it's a top-down vision by the president himself. So a lot of things are happening without good preparation. So there will be bad things going on and good things going on. But generally speaking, I think that China has been trying to do this, as China itself said, that as a complementary public good for the improvement of global governance. And it's going to be an open initiative for everyone. So let's work together for it. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Lou, for that enlightening presentation. I'm sure that's advanced our understanding quite a bit, and I'm sure it will provoke many questions, which I invite you to formulate ready for when we open the floor. We now turn to Maika Oshikawa from the World Trade Organization to comment. Thank you. Maika.
Okay, perfect. Thank you very much, Teresa, for the introduction, and then thanks to the previous speakers. Well, let me first put out the disclaimer. I'm certainly not a specialist on this one, the Belt Road Initiative from the WTO, but I have sort of accepted this invitation to speak, well, partly because the number of countries that I cover on a day-to-day basis, because what I do on a day-to-day basis in the WTO is to manage the negotiation, those who want to join the WTO, and then also to oversee those who have gone through this process. And just happen to be that many of the countries who has gone through this WTO accession process happen to be Belt Road countries. And the second reason why I have decided to sort of come and speak about it, as you probably, many of you have come here today, is to find out what is it, this Belt Road Initiative. By the way, I think the Institute has organized this seminar like 3 years ago. And then precisely for that reason, I actually went that lecture. And of course, it was very much about focused on, infrastructure, big investment, focus on connectivity. And then one question I asked to the speaker, speaker of that session was, so what does it mean in terms of sort of trade? Is it that the China actually use this initiative to create like a big free trade zone or free trade area? And the speaker at that time said to me, no, that was not the vision of the Chinese government. Well, he was not coming from the Chinese government, but that was his answer. But however, that question has sort of stayed with me since, so the last 3 years. So I thought this may be a good opportunity for me to revisit this question and see whether I could actually find answer to this question. So, as I said, on my day-to-day job, I cover countries who gone through accession process. And then last week, I just happened to be in Kazakhstan. Kazakhstan is probably the poster child of One Belt, One Road initiative because President Xi Jinping actually announced, I think, Silk Road first in Kazakhstan when he was meeting with President Nazarbayev. So I have been invited, since I was the organizer of the event last week, I have invited China to basically tell us what does it mean? What is the contribution of a Belt Road Initiative to WTO, or multilateral trading system? And this is what I got. Many things coincide with what Lou has just said. Yes, it covers more than 100 countries, international organization. Yes, it covers infrastructure, cooperation of production capacity, economic zone that Lou mentioned, there was 82, and cooperation among SMEs and e-commerce, blah, blah, blah. But sort of a long list continues. And in relationship to WTO, it was just put it, yes, very much consistent with the principle of WTO. Openness, inclusiveness, transparency, non-discrimination. Yes, that's all good. Yes, and then also cited the trade volume, over the last 5 years has exceeded 5 trillion, which is the number also cited by Lu. So I think they must have a standard set of number that I think Chinese government use. So that's pretty much what I got, except that they also gave a, I think good example. Of course, I was in Eurasia, so cited this railway project, connecting China to Europe, which actually was all connected last year, reaching 43 cities in 15 countries. It's really connect Asia to Europe. And this has been growing more than 50% per year. That was sort of nice. And I have to say that there were not many questions from the participants either. So I think questions still remained, what is it more than, infrastructure project, right? So when I came back yesterday, since I couldn't really get the answer to this burning question in Kazakhstan, so I decided that, well, in WTO 2 months ago, China has gone through trade policy review. That's for the WTO member to ask trade policy question on China. So I said, okay, let me see whether WTO member ask any questions. China received about 2,000 questions from 42 members. But however, I only actually found 12 questions on this initiative from 4 members. I can tell you which one. Well, obviously the United States, Nigeria, and Mexico, and Laos. And I have to say from 3 countries, it was very general question. How do you join? What is your plan? And so only one which had sort of asked elaborate question was, from the United States. So I have listed them on the slide, but some of them actually very much go along with some of the points raised by Lu. Yes, BRI has increased sovereign debt risk for some participants. What step China is taking, right? Yes, BRI is sort of, lacks transparency. What are you doing to increase transparency? How to provide more information? BRI projects are dominated by SOEs, state-owned enterprises. So how do you promote inclusiveness? Yeah. And the next one I found is quite interesting. So in unilaterally establishing courts under Supreme People's Court of China to adjudicate BRI dispute, is it China's intent to project participants will be obliged to use Belt Road Court to resolve dispute? There were some follow-up questions to that. And then will decision by this court, Belt Road Court, be subject to direction of the Communist Party? And another question was, is China's intent to use Belt Road Court to replace dispute settlement arrangement in existing bilateral or multilateral agreement? Okay. And then last one was asking relationship between Belt Road Initiative and upcoming China's international import export. So these are sort of the questions. So what it is, are they really a trade policy questions? What I would say that these are rather more systemic questions, which is, I think, really raised across the board about the China's trade policy. So this one, again, didn't really help me to provide me a good answer to the question, yes, what is really a trade policy? Is it a Belt Road Initiative? What is the trade policy angle? So what I have decided to do in the next slide is very much in line with what Lu has presented. By the way, this is a sort of a first, I have drawn 65 Belt Road country, which I believe is sort of an initial wave from 2015, which was an official document. And since then, there's no official list. It's a keep expanding. Some have said it's more than 100 countries. And by the way, if you actually go to the Belt Road portal, what you see is about Tonga, Zambia, pretty much anywhere around the world. So, but this is sort of a first set of Belt Road country, which I found, and then I put it, whether they are engaged with China in the FTA arrangement or preferential trade agreement. And then what I found was quite interesting. Of course, China is very active in engaging in FTA, starting from its own region, its neighborhood in Asia, and going down to the Pacific. China has FTA with Australia, New Zealand, but also quite active in Latin America, Chile, Costa Rica, and I think currently starting FTA negotiation with Panama. And then what I found, and then what you see here, I don't know how well you see, what I put in, when you look at the recent one that China has concluded, I thought was quite interesting. In 2017, last year, China has concluded the one with Maldives, and then also they have concluded with Georgia. Also this year, I think it was in May, China has concluded not FTA, but the economic partnership agreement with Eurasian Economic Union, which has 5 members, Russian Federation, Kazakhstan, Armenia, Kyrgyz Republic, and Belarus. So, and also those who are in red are ongoing negotiation FTAs, of course, which include RCEP, China-Israel FTA, and of course, as Lou mentioned, Gulf Cooperation Council, and China-Sri Lanka FTA, and China-Moldova FTA. So when you look at these recent initiatives, they are squarely in the first wave of Belt Road countries, okay? So lastly, what I have decided to look at it, what China is focusing on within the context of a WTO. Yeah, of course, China is active in all fronts, but some initiative I thought it stands out. Some, not initiative, but some of their focus stands out, which I think is very much in supportive of Belt Road Initiative. One was China's participation in the expansion of the Information Technology Agreement, which was reached in Nairobi in 2015. Of course, this has added additional list of ITA product, which resulted in greater duty-free trade on the IT product, which accounting for about 10% of the world trade in goods. Second one, Belt Road Initiative focus on connectivity, trade facilitation that Michele talked about. Yes, they are very active. Maybe one indication is China has decided to also contribute on the implementation of a TFA for developing countries by contributing to the facility by 1 million. Lastly, China, since last ministerial conference, WTO, quite large number of WTO members are engaged in so-called plurilateral / open-ended joint initiative, which was launched in Buenos Aires. Somewhere 70 to 80 WTO members are discussing in the open-ended manner. And among all, China is very active in this initiative as a co-sponsor. By the way, when I was in Kazakhstan last week, in addition to the event I was organizing, which was, of course, on WTO accession, there was also a high-level conference on investment facilitation, which was, again, sponsored by China. Okay? It's a way for China to promote this initiative, reach out to those countries who are not yet part of this initiative. China's also quite active in the other two initiatives, such as supporting micro, small, medium enterprises and the e-commerce. By the way, if you go to my first slide, these are particularly the area China said is promoting as a Belt Road Initiative. Okay, let me just conclude. I think my last 3 years of a search for this question, what is the trade policy angle of Belt Road Initiative? Is that, well, I think in many ways I share what Lou said. I think this was very much top-down vision placed on, I'm sure, Chinese government officials. So it has taken some time to make it concretize that vision to activity. So what I thought is now what has become is a strategic instrument, sort of setting the ground for China's deeper engagement with a selective set of strategic countries by pursuing FTAs. What do I mean by that? So China is moving away basically from once you are focusing with a Belt Road Initiative, focusing on infrastructure, which is a hard infrastructure. But then based on that, they're now moving into an engagement, which is also focused on soft infrastructure through FTA, which has not just market access, but also probably has, rule-making part. I have not compared, China's recently concluded FTA, but it will be interesting to look into what sort of rule has been made, what been agreed in this initiative, which is also going back to one of the concerns raised by the United States as a TPR. This initiative is equipped by dispute settlement mechanism, which basically has additional element, which has raised a concern by at least one member. So I agree in many ways with Lou's conclusion. It is a strategic instrument with a huge geopolitical implication, whose, I think, picture is yet to be played out. With this, let me finish my intervention. Thank you.
Thank you, Maike, for sharing your knowledge and insights. I think that was very useful, and I think you've highlighted some very interesting questions, particularly for legal scholars, as to what rules are being made and how they're going to be adjudicated and how that links with the geopolitical thing. So we now turn to Mark Wu to comment. Mark.
Thank you, Teresa, and to the Graduate Institute for organizing this workshop. Also, thank you to Michaela, Nadia, and the World Bank for bringing us all together this morning. Let me start by first wishing the Chinese nationals in the room, and for those who may be watching online in the People's Republic, a happy National Day. And what I'm going to raise today is a discussion about the dispute settlement mechanisms in the Belt and Road Initiative. I will also mention that another project for which I am engaged, but it's still very much in the early stages, is about the sustainable development, particularly focused on environmental governance issues. That, of course, has been raised by all of our speakers this morning. But I won't comment on that, but if there are questions during the Q&A, I'm happy to discuss that. But obviously, as Michaela has pointed out, there are large welfare gains to be had. So that obviously fits into one set of SDG objectives. There are also, of course, then impacts that has on emissions, on other types of pollutions and others which fit into other SDG objectives. And obviously, on these welfare gains, much of this touches on other core SDG areas such as food, water, and other things along those lines. So obviously, this is, if not the largest development related story of the 21st century, certainly one of the largest. And I'll just compliment some of the points which have already been raised by our speakers. One of the questions which is often raised is, what's China's goal in pushing out this Belt and Road Initiative? And I think our speakers have rightly touched on, this is, first of all, right, a top-down initiative from President Xi himself. That obviously means that this is a key objective in terms of setting China's geostrategic strategy. But that then raises another question, well, what is that geostrategic vision? And I think, as everyone here has pointed out, this is evolving. A couple of dimensions for you to keep in mind. China's geostrategic strategy is obviously linked to China's own domestic situation. So folks have also pointed out that the Belt and Road Initiative also serves as a mean as China's own economy slows, for China to deal with capacity issues, for China to take its knowledge, expertise, apply them to other different sectors, and for China to increase its own supply chain linkages outside of that which it's set up with advanced economies in Europe, United States, and elsewhere. And obviously all of that comes into play. But I think the one point I also do want to lay out, oftentimes I think in the West, here in Europe, in the United States, there is this sense that, is this a revisionist strategy? Is this something which is designed to subtly supplant this liberal international order and so forth? And while there is undoubtedly a contest that is going on here in our times, I think the key thing to note about the Belt and Road Initiative is, if there is a revisionism, it is really to the development narrative, right? There really has been a development strategy which the West has promulgated largely through a set of established institutions, through its development aid and so forth. And China has experienced its own development in a very different sense, one that has been infrastructure-led, but also sequenced in terms of the types of infrastructure that's laid out, which is trade, export-oriented, supply chain-oriented, and so forth. And I think the Belt and Road Initiative can be thought of much as the U.S. post-war vision was different than what occurred pre-war. This is also a different vision of development. And to the extent that there is a contest, it's not necessarily going to be one about trade norms or about investment rules and so forth. It really is just a different vision of development. So with that as a preface, let me then touch on dispute settlement within this Belt and Road Initiative. This is yet another picture of the Belt and Road Initiative. This is one which MERICS has put out. MERICS, along with the World Bank, have some of the most comprehensive databases of existing Belt and Road projects. One of the key things here is just basically getting a sense of what's BRI. And so this shows you, much like the map that Michaela showed you, there's a series of pipelines, there's a series of ports. They tie into two big corridors. One is the Silk Road Economic Belt, which is the land belt along the traditional Silk Road, which is essentially, right, this red belt here. And then the other is this Maritime Silk Road, which is just like in the color of Michaela's earlier map, right? This is traditional maritime linkages, which are laid out here in blue. But these are a series of infrastructure-related projects, and as we know, infrastructure projects are costly. They involve high fixed costs, right? They involve complex project management, and as Lou hinted at earlier, right, they oftentimes involve collaboration across multiple countries, but also between the public sector, private sector, and so forth. And so the opportunity for disputes here is quite high, particularly as different parties objectives may change as there's differences in financing, but also as government change and government commitment to certain projects will tend to wane over time. And we're seeing this play out, of course, in certain governments right now in Southeast Asia. So this raises the possibility of disputes, right? Obviously, there's a number of different contracts which are raised. These contracts will stipulate a certain choice of law, a certain choice of forum. And so there's a whole question as to how is this going to be handled along the BRI. And as Micah's slide alluded to, And as I will touch on in a minute, China is setting up a series of Belt and Road courts, and there is this concern that are these Belt and Road courts designed to basically usurp traditional mechanisms for dispute settlement. And what I'm going to argue today is, at least what I can tell so far, no, that's not the case. This is a supplement rather, or a complement, as opposed to a replacement or some form of revisionism. And so I'm going to explain a little bit what these are, how this plays out. But the first thing that I want to just point out is, with all of these contracts, traditionally, there is high distrust about going to local courts, particularly in some of these countries where rule of law may not be so well developed. Right? There is a hesitancy, right, to go to these national courts where you may not necessarily understand the language, the legal procedures, the rules themselves. Then you have the complication about taking the judgment from one foreign court, having to enforce it in another country, and so forth. So the traditional mechanism oftentimes has been to rely upon international arbitration. Right? Rather than to go to a national court, we'll take this to an arbitral body, have a set of appointed experts, and then the other benefit of arbitration is most countries, including most BRI countries, are members of the New York Convention. So then you can take this arbitral judgment, and any New York Convention countries will then force the arbitral judgment subject to the types of exceptions that are laid out in that treaty. So this has been the traditional mechanism by which infrastructure and other related contracts are done, right, including in Western aid projects. And this mechanism continues to be made available in BRI. So you have a number of these different institutions which are very prominent here in Europe, right? The ICC, certainly world-renowned for international arbitration. You can certainly bring this to London, to Stockholm, and elsewhere. You certainly need to just stipulate this in the contract. But also what we've seen over the last couple of years in Asia has been the rise of Asia as its own international arbitration center, and particularly Hong Kong and Singapore. But also China, CTAC itself has been around for quite a long time to handle investment arbitration, investment FDI arbitration in China, right? We have mediation centers, including a prominent one in Hong Kong. But also, right, you see countries like Russia, Thailand, and so forth setting up arbitration centers for projects related there. And all of this today remains available under BRI. So this raises a question, though, right? There is this contest, right? We know that BRI is this large source. There's a large unmet need, as was raised earlier, and these different arbitral institutions are really stepping it up to try to make themselves a center for BRI dispute resolution. This is going to continue to be the case, and what I've just pulled out here is how the ICC, right? This is just as this is a big piece of the pie for contracts themselves, there's going to be disputes associated with it. So this is a big piece of the pie for this contest for arbitration, as well as for lawyers' fees and so forth. So the ICC has dedicated a set of resources, particularly to BRI dispute resolution. It has a commission chair tied to one of the ICC members out of Hong Kong. But there is this recognition, right, that dispute resolution for BRI may need to take on its own unique features, to have its own unique expertise. And so this is playing out in the contest. And this, I would argue, is very much a traditional type of arbitration mechanism that exists to date. Okay? And this will continue to exist. And there is a marketplace among different parties to see, do you want to use this or not? However, there is possibly a demand for an alternative model. Why might you not want to go to one of those eminent arbitration centers? Well, you could have different parties that are involved with a contract. So think, for example, a largely Chinese domestic private sector, not necessarily that oriented towards one of these international arbitration settings, with a developing low-income country partner, right, for whom it's engaged in the contract. Neither of them are all that familiar with the legal procedures at the ICC or HKIAC or with the governing rules. right? There is a language issue. Most of these arbitrations are done in English. That may not be the first language or even the second language of many of the different parties that are involved in these contracts. There is the cost issue, right? These are costly. You hire some of the most prominent law firms in the world. They charge high fees. There is a speed issue, right? The World Bank itself has a study which I believe highlighted that the average time to resolve disputes in one of these can take over a year. I think the report highlighted 621 days, right? And so there's a trade-off to be had, right, where you're dealing with having to go to what is essentially, right, this is something with which you're not all that familiar. You're going to pay large costs, and you have higher certainty of enforcement, but is this really all worth it? So what I'm going to suggest here is for the large multinational corporations, right? So think about, right, your large solar players who are building, right, those solar farms which are supplying electricity needs with sophisticated public utilities and so forth. I think there's going to continue to be large demand for traditional international arbitration with all of the advantages, right? For them, they're going to be familiar with the legal procedures. The English issue is not a big deal, right? The cost is built into their legal fees and so forth, right? So there will be continued demand for all that, which is why the ICC and others are building it out. But there is a demand from other players for possibly an alternative model. So what I'm going to explain a little bit is what that alternative is that at least China is establishing, and we may see other countries in the BRI do something very similar to what China has done. So what China has done is set up two specifically dedicated Belt and Road courts. This were just rolled out. They were announced at the beginning of the year. They were rolled out this summer. This is the picture from the one in Shenzhen, which is the city right across the border from Hong Kong. The court in Shenzhen is designed to handle maritime disputes. So this is for the maritime road, right? That is related, that will be handled through the BRI court in Shenzhen. There's another court to be set up in Xi'an, which is the traditional endpoint of the Silk Road. These will be designed to handle disputes for the Silk Road economic belt, so the land-related types of disputes. But these are opt-in courts. So just as you could opt in to the ICC, you could opt in to HKIAC, you can then also opt in to the BRI court with jurisdiction in either Qianhai in Shenzhen or in Shanghai. In Xi'an. And so how are these set up? What will these handle? These fall under the auspices of the Supreme People's Court. This obviously raised some sensitivities, as you saw in the trade policy review, right? Since they fall under Supreme People's Court, Supreme People's Court then ties into the party structure, what influence will that have, and so forth. But the main issue here is China in the Supreme People's Court has always had a section which was dedicated to international commercial disputes. What this is doing is garnering a set of dedicated experts into a concentrated mechanism designed just to handle BRI issues in these two different courts. So in some ways, this is modeled upon, although there are some distinctions from other jurisdictions that have also done this. Other jurisdictions which under their own national court structure have specialized courts, right? And here in Europe, obviously, right, you know about those national specialized courts, right? You have specialized courts possibly to handle maritime disputes, to handle IP disputes and so forth. So this is setting that up under those auspices. But this is modeled in particular on jurisdictions which have a specialized court dedicated for international commercial and civil issues. And the one which is perhaps most prominent along these lines is Singapore, right? The Singapore courts have a section which is dedicated to this, but the other jurisdiction, several in the Middle East, in the UAE, the Dubai International Financial Courts, Abu Dhabi has one, Qatar has one, and so forth. So this is, if you think of the BRI courts, they are courts along those models, right? Rather than a dispute mechanism, which the Chinese are going to force out onto all BRI issues. These are opt-in. They will have jurisdictional rules. They will have legal procedures and so forth, right? So these are the judges, right, who will be, at least have been appointed to date. There are 8 judges who have been appointed to date who will be overseeing these BRI courts. They are all members of the Supreme People's Court. Judge Zhang is the senior ranking member of this. What you will see is that most of these judges, right, have foreign experience. They have experience on the Supreme People's Court with international civil measures and the like. Many of them are very fluent in English, right? And that is then concentrating these type of resources together in terms of another alternative fora for which you can hear your BRI disputes. And this raises the question, well then, how do BRI courts differ from any other specialized court? One, this is still a work in progress since this is just a few months old, so we may see other things work themselves out in the procedures. But 2 things that we know already is that traditionally when you litigate in Chinese courts, the documents need to be translated into Chinese. Here, many of the documents will be in English or in other jurisdictions. They don't need to be translated into Chinese. The other is that the courts themselves will have an expert committee of foreign legal experts who will deal with foreign law issues. So in common law, obviously, you have common law pleadings and international arbitration, right? You have pleadings about foreign law issues. In civil law jurisdiction, you have a different means of handling it, and this then allows for this expert committee to be brought in to deal with these foreign law issues. Now, just going back to this slide, you can see, though, that at least to now, the Singapore courts have not just Singaporean judges who are appointed, right, to hear the cases, but they also have 12 foreign justices who sit on this, largely people who are judges back home in their own jurisdictions, although one will be very familiar to you. Not all of them are judges. One of them is Taniguchi Yasuhei. So Taniguchi-san, of course, is known to many of you as a former member of the WTO appellate body. So in Singapore, you have these mixed, in the Singapore courts, you have a mixed set of Singaporean judges sitting with a foreign judge. The BRI courts, at least the way China has envisioned it today, will be largely these Chinese judges, but they will be informed by foreign law expert committee. So that's a different structure, right, while drawing on Singapore, still having some differences in that regard. And then there's a lot that remains unknown because this is just a process that's sort of evolving. To what extent will they have specialized procedural rules that differ from traditional procedural rules? Can you, for example, appeal for an order to use non-Chinese evidentiary rules? In Singapore, you can do that. It's unclear yet, but we'll see this play out as these disputes get brought. Can parties contract to limit rights of appeal? Obviously here, for expediency purposes, that's one of the major appeals of arbitration. And then, of course, here what you will have is a Chinese court judgment, which you will have to enforce through the Hague, bilaterally. And Singapore is a member of the Hague Convention, China is not. So there are a lot of these types of differences which will play out over the course of time. But to the extent that there are assets in China, or to the extent that the Chinese party may feel like it wants to use its own domestic courts, but doesn't necessarily, there may be discomfort from the other party with relying upon Chinese courts. The thought here is that the BRI courts will present this type of hybrid that may make an alternative fora. And the demand for this, we'll see, right, whether this plays out over the course of time compared to other international arbitration bodies and the like. But this is yet another alternative forum that will develop. We may see other jurisdictions create something quite similar. You may see over the course of time some standardization or at least arrangements that will play out on this, but this is all a work in progress to be seen, pushing along this expectation that there will be disputes. One last point that I'll make is that this does not cover investment disputes along the lines of investor-state dispute settlement. That continues to be governed by investment treaties. There are many types of investment treaties along between the 65+ BRI countries. They're often classified as belonging to 3 different generations, right? Early generation, which cover very much basics. A second generation, which updated that, but didn't have quite the type of pro-state types of evolutions. And then this third generation, which have much more sophisticated, right, elements inside the treaties to cover different types of regulatory flexibility the state may want to have for different elements. So we should expect also a series of investment modernization efforts to take place among the BRI countries. There's obviously discussions along this lines with many of the BRI member governments, but the BRI courts are not, at least today, envisioned to take on that type of role. So hopefully that helps to illuminate or at least shed some understanding. This is still an evolution. It's just a few months old, but I just wanted folks to understand a bit more about how we can envision dispute settlement along the Belt and Road. Thank you.
Okay, thank you, Mark, for laying out the landscape on dispute settlement. I think it'd be interesting to track that shifts of forum choice and actual disputes if indeed researchers can have access to those actual disputes. I know that I'm burning with questions for all of the speakers, but in the interests of sharing a little bit amongst the people in the room, I'm going to open the floor for questions or short comments. And I ask you, if you please say your name, your affiliation, if you have a question, to whom it's addressed, and if you have a comment, please keep it succinct, so because I would like to take as many as possible. And a little show of hands, I know that I have Tom over there, who's going to go first, because he asked me some time ago. Tom.
Thanks very much, Teresa. Tom Miles from Reuters News Agency. I have 2 questions, if I may. First one to Mr. Liu, I think, or anybody else who'd like to comment. To what extent do you think the Chinese government and the leadership envisage themselves retaining control and ownership over this network in the future? It's not clear to me if they see it as a sort of, project which will continue to exist under some sort of Chinese controlling mind, or if they're injecting, capital and ideas and trying to open things up in the sort of general interests of China. Do you think they want to retain control in the future? For example, so they can sort of, turn bits of the network on and off, or, decide how it's run, perhaps for political reasons. Second question to Mark Wu, I guess. It's about these judges that you just mentioned. As I'm sure you know, there's a tremendous amount of controversy about what's going on in Xinjiang at the moment with the Muslim population there. And I guess, that's going to be an important sort of part of the Belt and Road network. But if you've got a situation like that where clearly the Chinese government has a fundamentally different understanding of what's going on to what foreign critics are saying, then, is it possible to trust, was it 8 judges who are members of the Chinese court hierarchy? They may be impartial in terms of the Chinese legal system, but if they're coming at questions like this with a very, Chinese frame of mind about what the political situation is, are people going to accept that as an impartial way of arbitrating these kind of disputes? Thanks.
Okay, thanks, Tom. I always love your questions. I'll give our panel members a little time to reflect before coming back. I have another intervention there, one, and you'll be next. Yeah, so first you, then Emmanuel, and then over here. Go ahead.
Thank you very much. I have 2 related questions. One is, there were 2 very brief, very superficial references to the Marshall Plan, and basically very derogatory sounding references. Now, the Marshall Plan was unique in the sense that it made clear that it's the interests of the Europeans and European cooperation were the driving force. There was no, one of the outstanding features was that in particular in Mr. Hoffman's 49th speech about European integration, he said, our interests are the European interests, and certainly we are not here to promote American exports. And in fact, they encourage discrimination against American exports. And that brings me to my second question. I think 2 years ago at Webster, there was a very interesting conference on the Silk Road, new Silk Road Initiative, where there were people who said, well, this is going to be a convenient vehicle to promote Chinese exports, in particular in sectors that seem to be close to over capacity. Now, I was a little bit surprised. I found very interesting the comments by the lady from WTO, and I appreciate that. But on that issue, you really you passed over it. Thank you very much.
Okay, thank you. Now we have a question at the back, Ambassador.
Thank you, Teresa. Manuel Tihanki, Philippine Mission to WTO. So just on the Belt and Road Initiative, I think just a quick comment that, of course, it's a massive initiative that hopefully improves logistics between Europe and Asia. And, of course, I did note the comment that the WTO representative did mention that it's not exactly clear on how the trade aspect comes in, although there is an initiative now in WTO on investment facilitation for development. And I think infrastructure and investment has a key role in improving trade volumes and trade and development. My question then goes on that issue, if there are any recent developments on how investment helps trade. My other main question is really very interesting for Mark regarding the dispute settlement, the BRI courts. And we do see the distinction between the role of the appellate body and the WTO being different from the BRI courts. But if you could just revisit how it is not going to be an alternative to ISDS. I just want to get a little more understanding, because if you do resort to the BRI court, would that not really exclude the alternative ISDS approaches? Thank you.
Okay, thank you. So, okay, I was going to take, okay, let me take Nadia, then.
Thanks, Teresa. So I'm Nadia Rocha from the World Bank. So I have one question for Mr. Lu and one for Mark. So the first one is related with the transparency. That is something that also Michele mentioned, and you were in fact referring in your presentation that you were saying I had to dig a lot, like across the different web pages to understand like which are the different projects that are taking place. So do you know, or like is there an initiative like just to try to pull all together all of these projects to in fact like improve this transparency from the side of China? So this was the first question. The second one for Mark is more, it will relate a little bit with the second panel, and is more a vision, and I wanted to see your point of view. So you were talking about this new demand for this like dispute settlement mechanism, like these new courts, because like there is heterogeneity in the regulatory in the domestic regulations of the different countries that are part of the BRI. So if we think about the fact that like China, there are more agreements that are taking place between China and the BRI countries, and within also the BRI countries, and these agreements are going beyond tariffs, and they are including public procurement, investment. So how do you, like, what is your vision of how these two things are gonna like complement each other, right? So if countries are getting like are harmonizing, they are closing the governance gap between them. So what is going to be the role of these courts that you are talking about in the future when deeper agreements are taking place across countries?
Is your question short? Because I want to take answers soon.
Thank you. I'm Asim from the Permanent Mission of India to the WTO. I'll keep it very short. Actually, Ambassador Tihanki has already raised a question, but I saw the presentation made by Ms. Maika on the WTO aspect of some aspects related to WTO. I just wanted to know a bit more about from the panelists, especially on this measure on investment facilitation. I mean, how does this complement the Belt Road initiative? And also on transparency, there was a question which was asked and it has been raised in many presentations. So what could be done more to, number one, increase transparency, and also on the nature of projects, because there is a view that these are only infrastructure projects. I mean, are these projects which also integrate into trade, manufacturing, and those aspects? Because that is something which doesn't come out very clearly in the narrative. It just seems to be driven by infrastructure. Yeah.
Okay, thank you. So I now turn back to the panel. I think we'll go a little bit reverse order. We'll go with Micah's question, if that's okay.
Sure, okay. I guess on the trade and investment link, okay, what sort of discussion is on this investment facilitation? The point I was basically making, I think China, and by the way, this is not investment in terms of market access, more about the procedure, how to facilitate. I think emphasis is on the facilitation rather than investment, you know, in a way very similar to trade facilitation. So there's a discussion, I think it's mainly also about best practices, how to facilitate inward investment, how to share the information, you know, in terms of procedure. So I think this is sort of the current discussion where the joint initiative, which is not encompassing all the WTO member, but those who want to discuss this issue because they do believe trade and investment, they go together. So, and based on what I have seen in Astana, there was quite, I think, support for this, and especially in Eurasia, which is the big region where you actually have, it's a mass land where still, despite Belt Road Initiative, much more investment is definitely needed in terms of connectivity. So all I can say that I found there good support for this initiative, by the way, which is in some ways very much complementary to what China's Belt Road Initiative and the China's initiative on investment facilitation, and also China's also active investment, engagement or participation promoting the other two initiatives. I think mentioned on overcapacity, well, my point was not out of a 2,000 question that WTO member asked, what I sort of puzzled me, despite of this, everybody talking about this initiative, it was really very only few questions were asked. And then it didn't really touch upon, to me, it was very sort of a trade policy, critical trade policy issue. Overcapacity obviously has come up in the TPR, trade policy review discussion, but it was not very much in the context of, Belt Road Initiative. And I think what I take it is still I think many of you in this room still have a question, what is it exactly? I think we started to really see the surface of what it is. And so that was really an indication that still, I think WTO membership are trying to figure out what, Belt Road Initiative is, like many of you in this room. Okay, I think let me end here for now.
Okay, thank you. Now, I think you've both got 2 questions each. Would you like to take your 2 first, Mark, and then we'll turn to Lou?
Sure. I think I actually have 3, but okay. I'll combine 2 of them together. So, Tom, first time, thanks for your question. Obviously, as you point out, it's not just Xinjiang, but there are a number of different issues that raise sensitivity, political sensitivities inside China. I think to answer your question very succinctly, right, the market for legal and arbitral fora will determine that, and that will have to play into whether or not there's demand for these BRI courts. To the extent that both parties, right, have to agree to this or they have to opt into this. So to the extent that there are concerns about political interference, that will reduce demand, and to the extent that there is a view that these are neutral fora for which this provides an efficient means for dispute settlement, that will obviate some of those types of concerns. But even today, right, prior to the establishment of BRI courts, there are contracts between parties which choose Chinese courts as the choice of forum. So this is creating yet one more alternative in that regard. Ambassador, your question about ISDS, let me explain a little bit here, right? Right now, the BRI courts that are set up by China do not have jurisdiction to hear investor-state disputes. They're also not set up traditionally as ISDS would be set up, right, in terms of that. So I think the evolution or view is this is designed to tackle what would be commercial disputes, but not ISDS, because the infrastructure that's set up doesn't look like any type of ISDS infrastructure. Moreover, right, with ISDS, the two parties to the investment agreement would have to opt in to this, making this type of fora available, and no treaty to date even considers, right, using national court as the forum for investor-state dispute settlement. Several treaties do have a requirement that you have to go through national court procedures first, right? But this BRI court is part of that national court, but it's not that type of traditional national court recourse as envisioned there. And then finally, Nadia, on your question about will this type of dispute settlement lead to greater harmonization and so forth, I think the quick answer here to say is it's too early to tell. This will really depend on to what extent BRI really fosters deep integration between these various countries in this arrangement, and obviously that's a topic which you all will be discussing this afternoon.
Thanks. First, about the question of Thomas. We have done this quite often in the past. So before I answer the question, my question to you is that, are you going to quote me? No, that's a joke. And I'm not a diplomat anymore. I don't mind if you quote me or not quote me. No, independently, I just to throw out my very preliminary thoughts, because what you have asked is really a very complicated question. My simple answer to that is that there's no, how to say, how to say that, and there's no single answer to that question. Because many projects, when we talk about BD infrastructure, BD and many other things, we need to look at case by case. Let's take infrastructure, for example. As Mark has said, that is costly and needs a lot from the local, the engagement of local governments. So it's really issue about whether the local government or the local partner has the capacity to pay it back or not. I was talking to quite some Chinese companies who are doing big projects abroad along Belt and Road. What they simply told me is that if the local government could pay the money back immediately, they will be glad to wash hands and work out with the profits they have. But if not, there will be proper arrangement about how soon they could pay back, how much each year, and under what conditions. So we will see different contracts here. Some are longer, some are shorter, and so on and so forth. So there's no unique answer to that. To that. The other thing about this gentleman, about the reference to Marshall Plan, the thing is that I don't think China's intention by differentiate Belt and Road Initiative from Marshall Plan is to tell that this one is good and that one is bad. No, I don't think that's the intention. The simple thing is that China, because a lot of experts in the very beginning trying to put an analog between the two and try to say that this is Chinese Marshall Plan, and the Chinese Foreign Affairs Minister Wang Yi and also the Foreign Affairs spokesperson have been very cautious, and you could easily find all the answers there. But just simply to give a few answers to that is why they are different. The first thing is that when you say that our interests are European interests, in many of the analyzed scholars, including someone here in Europe, the Marshall Plan did only target Western European countries. because at that time we still had the, what do you say, the Berlin Wall, and we still have this eastern and the western part. And the Marshall Plan didn't cover the eastern part. And for sure there's an exclusion. But as China has said that we are open, we're not open to the whole Europe, we're open to the whole world, and the whole kind of bunch of organizations, countries, and private sectors, and so on and so on. So that's the first thing. The second thing is that the Marshall Plan, in the eyes of many scholars, is a kind of a unilateral grant, if not a gift, but something to help the European countries for its integration. But China, as it is said, is mutual consultation, is mutual cooperation, and mutual benefits. So everyone have to earn out of it, including Chinese themselves. So it's just not a Chinese unilateral gift for the world. No, that's not the plan. I mean, those are just two things to explain why Chinese believe they are different and not. Another question also by this gentleman about, well, whether this is a convenient vehicle to export Chinese exports and to shift its overcapacity. Well, that's, the answer could be yes and no. Because as I have presented, this initiative is so comprehensive and including on the trade. On trade, it means imports and exports. So China is called as the factory of the world. It will be, how to say, impossible to think that with this initiative, China would only import and not export. I mean, it doesn't make any sense. China does have overcapacity, for sure, in many sectors. But of course, it will also be impossible to imagine that China could just go to a country and say that, well, I have this overcapacity in this sector, so take it. I mean, the local would decide whether I need it, I want it, or whether I benefit from it. I was, of course, other than my humble professor work, to make a living, I'm also in China representing a few companies, including one e-commerce. So I was just taking my team to Vietnam not long ago, just to see whether we could establish some local offices and then to benefit from the booming e-commerce in Vietnam. So what I heard from the local governments and also some Chinese investors there is that now, if you want to invest in Vietnam, some kind of textiles, as what has happened 5 to 10 years ago, no, that's impossible, because the Vietnamese are very cautious that the Chinese could shift their polluting, dialing sector into Vietnam. No. But e-commerce is very welcome. So they open their arms wide towards my team and myself. So I mean, this is an issue not easy to answer, but I mean, this is mostly kind of collaboration between China and others, and also judgment by the local. Nadia York's question about transparency. It's quite chaotic. It's a mess, I would say. And remember, I have shown you these 82 development zones there. MOFCOM is in charge of that. I went on the MOFCOM Chinese version. I only found a list of 16, which was put on the website 2016, I think that's the year. So we have a big gap between 82 and 16. I don't think MOFCOM, my former colleagues, intentionally try to hide information. I mean, maybe they're just lazy, or maybe nobody's doing that. I mean, and also, as I said, it's kind of such a comprehensive initiative. Many things, everyone in China, be it central governments, all the ministries, be it local and regional governments, they are all behind this, because simple reason is they are politically incentivized to do this for the leaders and to deliver the mission, and that's their job. So I mean, there are all kinds of things going on, and and also because of it is still something new, only 5 years old. So I mean, there is a lot of chaos in it. So I hope it will improve, but I don't know. Of course, for the moment, I heard from nobody that this kind of a unified, kind of single initiative to improve transparency. But a lot of ministry have information scattered around their websites and their statements, so it's still going to be a problem. Questions from our Indian friends. Investment facilitation itself, for the moment, is still not yet, I mean, how to say, specifically presented as Belt and Road Initiative project. This is a more multilateral thing, which China is trying to do here as a kind of participation in the plurilateral initiatives and so on and so forth. Of course, there are also something, I mean, this is a negotiation apart. But on the other hand, I mean, investment and also trade facilitation is also a bigger element in the initiative. So there are a lot of things going on there, and China has been emphasizing also with projects and on that. But that's more a kind of bilateral initiatives implementation, not negotiation. So there are many things going on there. And of course, as I said, everyone is politically incentivized to put everything behind the Belt and Road Initiative, I mean, for obvious reason. No transparency is the same thing, too many things going on, and there's no easy way. And for me, it's to every time to do a presentation, I have to spend hours digging out all kinds of statements, news reports in Chinese, English version, trying to find the appropriate information. But that's it, and that's for the moment the chaos. Let's see whether it improves. Thanks.
Okay, thanks, Lou. I had originally intended to have another round of questions, but is there anyone with a burning question? But unless I see one, I'd like to have Michaela comment on some of the issues that were raised in the discussion.
So now, just to thank everyone, we are really on listening mode, so this was really interesting for us. We didn't coordinate much with the other presenters, and I think it was extremely, it's as if we had coordinated for days on this presentation. So it was, this was really great. I think maybe just two quick comments that I would like to give related to a number of questions that came up. There are a number of issues of questions that come up on geopolitical aspects. This is really not part of the study that we are doing. So I don't have anything to say on behalf of the World Bank or our research. One only thing that I would suggest is that I understand that there are always questions where in Europe this is a proposal from China. So it's always between the relationship between large players. When there is an interesting book on the history of the Silk Road by a professor of history at the Georgetown University, and when you read that, the messages that come out is that it's really the land in the middle that matter. It was not that much the two extremes, but all this area in Central Asia, South Asia, that really mattered, and the stability of the Asia of the region is really what mattered for the Silk Road trade. So when there were the Persian empires and the Mongol empires, that's when trade really flourished. That's when Marco Polo crossed. It was when there was the Mongol Empire. So it's just an invitation also, not just to think in terms of the large players, but also what's in the middle. And the second point I would like to make is on these various questions on the international governance structure. Again, it's something that we deal only partially in this series of studies, and I think these are extremely interesting set of questions on dispute settlements and other issues. When we had our missions in China, we had several meetings, and I think the word that I heard most frequently by the authorities was multilateralism. The Belt and Road Initiative is a multilateral initiative. So I take it that if it is a multilateral initiative, it will also heavily rely on current multilateral institutions. I don't think there is the will every time to the need every time to invent the wheel. If we want to facilitate trade, which according to the data that I was showing and the empirical exercise that we did, will have a big boost on trade, then obviously the first thing will be rely on the trade facilitation agreements and the current set of institutions and tools that we have, and probably similar logic should apply to things related to dispute settlement in international investments. So I'll stop here, but again, thank you very much to everyone.
Okay, thank you, Michaela. So I have two sentences from Lou and then one from Micah before I close.
No, there's something important information which I forgot to mention answering this gentleman's question about imports and exports. I think I should say this to do fair to our friend who asked the question. No, I mean, some figures I digged out from Chinese website is that in 2017, the Chinese exports to the Belt and Road countries grow by 8.5%, and its imports from Belt and Road countries grow by 19.8%. And the first time in the past 5 years that import growth was bigger than export growth. Of course, the second thing is that China has already launched this Shanghai Import Expo, which will take place next month. I'm going there, and I will be interested to see whether that would help expand imports of China from all over the world, including Belt and Road countries. I think those are information to share. Thanks.
Thank you, Micah.
Okay, actually, this is exactly what I wanted to mention. Yes, I think whether Belt Road Initiative has been the tool to promote China's export, just I think the initiative that Lou mentioned, I think it's worthwhile looking at. I think this is the first time I have seen this trade fair usually is to promote your own export, but China is organizing this big conference, led by the President Xi Jinping to actually, focusing on how much they can import from the rest of the world. So I think it's a very unique concept from my point of view. And of course, we are yet to see whether, what that will result in. But I think China is mindful of the criticism. And then I think they are trying to balance this. And then that's what's very much supported by the statistics just given by Lou. Thank you.
Okay, thank you, Micah. So I'm going to try and sum up at least how my understanding has advanced, just for the sake of doing that. So one thing I would think is perhaps one of the things that the liberal order didn't do particularly well over the past 30, 40 years was development, or at least it's not finished. And the scale of some of the infrastructures that are required are quite large, and that only players with very large horizons, long-term horizons and large players will really be able to oversee that. And as China grows, we can expect that such a large country will play an important role. But my plea for anyone who's listening is please make it transparent, at least so that we researchers can kind of track what's going on. Perhaps the World Bank has a role there. I always say to my bosses that web lags work, so I completely understand that the websites are not necessarily functioning in the way that a researcher might like them to be. But again, perhaps the World Bank has a role to put some of the things there, but anything that can be done to help make it more transparent, I think will be welcome to the world and will make it seem less threatening to those that might otherwise be threatened. Before I close the meeting, I'm going to just run you through a couple of the things. The lunch is just outside, so please bear with me. So I'm going to run you through a few of the things that the Centre for Trade and Economic Integration is organising this week, our first trade week. So on Friday, I'm going to work backwards. Friday the 5th, if you're invited to the event that's run by the Cato Institute, that's in here. If, on the other hand, you're working on fossil fuels, trade and fossil fuels, that's at the Villa Barton with the IISD. On Thursday the 4th, I'm going to make a shameless plug for session 100 at the at the WTO Public Forum, which takes place at 15:30 in S1, preceded by a coffee break. It's on trade and environment, and it's organised by the mission, the mission of Chinese Taipei to the World Trade Organization. That's on trade and the environment, and I shall be moderating. And that should be a very interesting, perfectly balanced discussion with someone from industry, someone from government, and a scholar. And as I said, I'll be moderating. Again, working backwards, Wednesday at 6:30 in the evening in room A2, we have the very sexily titled We've Got to Talk About Donald, which is organised with our friends at Sussex University, and Richard Baldwin will be opening that with a little talk. So 18:30 A2, that's in Petal 1. Tuesday is the first day of the public forum. You'll be there for the whole day for the opening session and the networking cocktails. See you there. And just back to Monday, we're back at 1:30. We're sticking to time. We're back in this room with Richard Baldwin on reflections on the future of globalization, followed by a panel on regional trade agreements, and then one on Latin American integration. So the only thing that remains is, for me, all of those events, with the exception of the one at the WTO Public Forum, the logistics are being put together by Angelica Zaninelli, who has done an absolutely splendid job. Thank you, Angelica. And please join me in a round of applause for our speakers, for all of those with questions, for everyone that listened, and for Angelica. Thank you. Oh, sorry, this event was live streamed, and then the link is on the event webpage. There are three separate live streams. So there's three, each one has a separate event page, and the live streaming is there. And then afterwards, it will be